Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Alexandrian Society's Spring 2021 lecture series, sponsored by the History Department and the Department of African American Studies at VCU. As I said earlier, my name is Charlie Gillum, and I am a senior here at VCU as well as the Society's vice president. Founded in the 1960s, the Alexandrian Society is one of the oldest student organizations at VCU. Its focus has changed over time, however. Since Professor Bernard Moit became the faculty advisor of the Society in 2003, the Alexandrian Society has been dedicated to the promotion of excellence in historical scholarship with a focus on the Atlantic world in such areas as slavery, race, and gender. Through its work, the Society has advanced VCU's mission of equity, inclusion, and diversity over the past 2 decades. It has also provided a forum for mentorship, personal and networking opportunities for students at VCU. Though it is dedicated to the study of history, membership is open to all VCU students, irrespective of concentration or major, are welcome. The Alexandrian Society meets weekly in person on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Anyone who is interested in learning more about the Society is encouraged to email our membership recruitment chair, Max Knight. We'll put his email in the chat in a moment. I'd be remiss to say if a large benefit of membership in the Alexandrian Society is the mentorship and direction from Professor Bernard Moit, which, amongst other things, includes his hand in editing and drafting these very introductions of our esteemed guest lectures. I'd like to thank Professor Moit not only for his thoughts on the early drafts of this introduction, but also for his constant help in everything that we do in the Alexandrian Society. Now, to the business of the day. Professor Alejandro de La Fuente is the director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African American Research at Harvard University. His most recent books are Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, Freedom, and Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana, co-authored with Ariela J. Gross, and Afro-Latin American Studies, an Introduction, co-edited with George Reed Andrews. He's also the curator of several art exhibits dealing with racism in Cuba. After studying law at the University of Havana, Dr. de la Fuente became an instructor of history at the University of Havana Law School, as well as a researcher for both the Institute of Social Sciences and the Cuban Academy of Sciences, and the Institute of History in Havana. In 1987, he was the research coordinator for a research group for the Attorney General of Cuba. He then graduated from the University of Pittsburgh in 1996 with a PhD in history and a graduate certificate in Latin American studies, after which he took a position as an assistant professor at the University of South Florida, Tampa. In 2000, he moved to the University of Pittsburgh, where he became a full professor in 2009. In 2013, he moved again, this time to Harvard University, where he has been ever since. There, he has served as the chair of the Cuban Studies Program, director of the Afro-American Research Institute, professor of African and African American Studies, and most recently as the chair of that department. As well as writing the book that this lecture is named after, Professor de la Fuente has written 3 others. Diago, The Pasts of This Afro-Cuban Present was released in 2017, Havana and the Atlantic in the 16th Century in 2008, and A Nation for All, Race, Inequality, and the Politics of 20th Century Cuba in 2001. He has written for such publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC Mundo, and the Miami Herald. He's also served as the editor for Cuban Studies, which is the preeminent journal for scholarly work on Cuba since 2013. Professor de la Fuente has earned numerous grants, fellowships, and awards. He is a 6-time winner of the Ford Foundation grant, the recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Geddes Foundation Connecting Art Histories grant. He was an Andrew Mellon Predoctoral Fellow at the University of Pittsburgh and a Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Dissertation Fellow, and won a John Carter Brown Library Research Fellowship at Brown University. This evening, we are extremely honored to host Professor Alejandro de la Fuente, whose lecture is entitled Being Free, Being Black. Please join me in welcoming Professor de la Fuente to the Alexandrian Society Fall Lecture Series. Professor, the floor is now yours.
Many thanks, Charlie, for the gracious introduction. I need you to make me co-host so that I can share my screen, please.
Yeah.
Let me start by saying thanks, first and foremost, to the students of the Alexandrian Society for reaching out and for the invitation to be with you today to have a conversation about my latest book with Ariela Gross, my colleague from the University of Southern California. Special note of thanks to Benjamin Wachicki, the president of the Alexandrian Society, who first reached out to me about this, to the Society's students' mentor, Professor Bernard Moy, who has been a willing and gracious interlocutor during the process of putting this together, including a last-minute hiccup with a link that he helped me solve in order to be here with you, and to the colleagues in the departments of African American Studies and History. I see this as an opportunity to chat informally about the book, to talk to you about some of the questions that guided our research, some of our findings, and perhaps also some of the ways in which the book points to future possible lines of research for people like the members of this society who may be interested in pursuing this kind of work. Now, I should start by saying that this is a book. Sometimes books pose new questions, right? This is not one of those books. This book actually tries to offer a new look at a very old question. And that very old question is a question that was developed from the mid-20th century by a group of comparativists, of distinguished historians, predecessors, people to whom I owe an intellectual debt. And the question basically was, how come slave societies in the Americas ended up producing very different racial formations and very different understandings of race and racial difference? How come during a period when the enslavement of people of Africans and people of African descent characterized many societies in the region, by the 19th century, some of these societies, the understanding of Blackness, the social, political, cultural understandings of Blackness were significantly different. I think one of our colleagues got unmuted. So this question was first and foremost developed by a mid-20th century scholar, Frank Tannenbaum. This is a book that many of the colleagues in the history department will probably recognize, Slave and Citizen, something of a classic in the historical comparative literature concerning slavery and race relations in the Americas. And one of those books, I always tell my students, that people love to hate, right? This is one of those books that are still discussed. The book is still in print. It's still, I used it in my seminar this year here at Harvard, right? And it's a book that is frequently referred to, but that frequently people have not actually carefully read. You know, it's one of those books that is famous and that therefore everybody feels the need to drop the name here and there, but that very few people these days take the time to read. And it continues to be a very insightful book precisely because the book posed that question. And the question has stayed with us. It is a question that other comparativists, other scholars, Herbert Klein, Carl Degler, Stanley Elkins, Harry Hutting, tried to develop in the 1960s and 1970s. And that is a concern that then was borrowed by another thread of scholarship that was basically a group of scholars working on comparative race relations between the US and South Africa. I'm thinking scholars such as Stanley Greenberg, John Sell, George Frederickson, and Anthony Marks. The most recent, and from my point of view, the most remarkable effort in this comparative tradition is the book by Robert Cottrell, The Long Lingering Shadow. So I see our book as part of this intellectual genealogy. This is not a new question. We are basically trying to offer a fresh look at this old question that has been broached before by many distinguished scholars. As I said before, the question basically is how, why, and how in plantation of slave societies that developed roughly at the same time between the 16th century and the 19th centuries, societies built on the association between African origin and enslavement, societies built on slavery. How come, despite those similarities, by the mid-19th century, the social implications of Blackness were so different in places like Cuba on the one hand and Virginia and Louisiana on the other? A free man of color in the 1850s in Cuba could legally get married to a white woman. A free person of color in mid-19th century Cuba, a plantation slave society, could attend public schools, could be part of military formations like militias, could belong to religious associations of different kinds, and through those associations could participate in public life. In Louisiana and Virginia, in mid-19th century Louisiana and Virginia, meanwhile, free people of color saw their churches and their schools closed, faced criminal prosecution for getting married across the color line, as you all know, and risked being kidnapped, imprisoned, and even re-enslaved just for staying on the state of their birth, because a number of laws basically prompted them to abandon the state of their birth. In Louisiana and Virginia, the presumption that civic acts could be performed only by white people was so strong that it was used by people of African descent to claim whiteness, to claim that they were not, in fact, people of African descent. Citizenship in Louisiana and Virginia had come to be associated strictly with whiteness. It was incompatible with African origin. In Cuba, although the free population of color faced legal limitations of various kinds, the process of racializing civic acts as something exclusively white did not advance to the same extent. And the question has been, since the mid-20th century, why? And that's a question that we try to answer in our work. Now, most scholars, most previous scholars who have looked at this question, including Tannenbaum, the title of this book is From Slave to Citizen, what they did was to go back to slavery, to the study of slavery, in order to find answers to this divergence, to this difference. What Tannenbaum used to call differential slave systems. In our view, however, it is not in the law of slavery where we need to look for answers for this. It is actually in the law of race and in the law of freedom, which is not exactly the same body of legislation. The law of freedom was used as a crucial space for the creation of racial regimes, because laws regulating the lives and institutions of free people of color, not slaves, not enslaved people, but free people of color, those are the laws that created the boundaries between white and black, instead of the boundaries between free and enslaved. Those laws imposed degradations and handicaps on blacks, not on slaves, but on blacks, regardless of their legal status. In our history, therefore, what mattered in the development of racist legal regimes was not a contrast between Iberian and Anglo-Saxon slave systems a la Tannenbaum, that is not relevant to us, but the connections between whiteness and citizenship, how that connection developed in some areas and not in others. The connection between whiteness and citizenship, between blackness and slavery. That is the very impossibility of Black citizenship in some, and even freedom in some cases, and not in others. So let me now share, if I may, my screen with you. Here are simply the covers of the two editions of the English edition and the Spanish edition, Ser Libre, Ser Negro, which came out in Madrid last year. We chose three locations: Cuba, Louisiana, and Virginia, or to be precise, it's actually Havana, New Orleans, and Virginia, that represent windows into different legal traditions and regimes of English, French, and Spanish manufacture. We were very interested in the case of New Orleans and Louisiana because this is a hybrid case that is first French, Spanish for a number of decades, and, as you know, and then undergoes a process of what Judith Schaffer has called Americanization of its legal system during the 19th century. Unlike older comparative studies, certainly unlike Tannenbaum's book, we pay very careful attention to change across time. In other words, we are very interested in tracing how these legal understandings evolve across time. And that's why we divide our study in three different and fundamental periods. The first one is something of a foundational period that goes from basically the initial moments of colonization in each territory, and this of course changes from place to place. In the case of Cuba, it's early 16th century. In the case of Virginia, it's early 17th century. In the case of Louisiana, it's early 18th century. And that foundational period is the period in which, as we argue, some basic commonalities evolve. We then have a second period, which corresponds to the Age of Revolution, which we date somewhere between the 1760s and 1830. This may be a chronology that this may sound or may appear a little long to some scholars of U.S. history, but of course we're trying here to signal or to acknowledge not only the importance, the overwhelming importance of the Haitian Revolution, we're also trying to incorporate and to keep in mind here the movements for independence that are happening in Spanish America in the 1810s and the 1820s. And then finally, a period roughly between the 1830s and the 1850s or 1860s of consolidation, expansion, maturation of racial orders in all these jurisdictions. These are moments in which plantation slavery expands in all these jurisdictions before the wars that would eventually destroy slavery in the three places, because this is another interesting commonality, that in order to destroy slavery in all these places, war was necessary. That applies to Cuba as well. The destruction of plantation slavery in Cuba began in a way with the Independence War of 1868. So just a few years after the Civil War in the United States, and partly influenced by the results of the Civil War in the United States. But we do not go into the process of emancipation per se, because other scholars have already done that work. I told you that the initial period, this foundational period, is marked by a fundamental similarity. And we emphasize that similarity in our book. And that similarity is that in all three jurisdictions, local legislators made a systematic effort to associate Blackness with enslavement, to associate Blackness with slavery, to link Blacks, Negros, Negroes, Noirs with the social degradation that is associated with enslaved status. The slave societies of the Atlantic built race as a category of difference through the law. And what they did, think about it, was to convert, was to transform, and that's why we say becoming Black, was to transform Africans who came from a variety of linguistic families and cultures, to transform Africans into basically one category of the basement: Negro, Noir, Negro, Black, Preto in Brazil. Right? In the process, erasing and compressing a multitude of cultures, languages, histories, experiences, lineages, all of that was compressed into and under a single category of degradation. This is, if you think about it, this is a process of unparalleled epistemic violence. Peoples of all these cultures, of all those linguistic families, of all those religions, all that human richness, all that variety is compressed under just one epithet. And that epithet is inscribed in the law, in French America, in British America, and in Spanish America, and in Portuguese America. This is an Atlantic process. And it is that massive commonality we build from that massive commonality. The legal prohibitions that apply to all Black men and women, free or enslaved alike, or that define certain actions of any Black or mulatto, free or enslaved, against whites as a crime, help to define degradation in racial terms rather than in terms of enslavement. For the purposes of that legislation, the important thing was not whether a person was enslaved or free. For the purposes of those regulations, the important thing was if a person was Black or white. Since the 16th century, many legal regulations concerning slaves targeted Blacks, equating both categories in the law, Black and slave, as if they were coterminous category. And here is an example, a very early example. In fact, to my knowledge, this is the first ordinance ever passed in the Americas concerning slavery. It's an ordinance from 1522, issued by the town council of Santo Domingo in La Española, what would later be the island where later, that is home today to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And that initial ordinance concerning slaves is graphically titled Traslado de las Ordenanzas de los Negros. It's an ordinances of the Blacks, not of the slaves, but of the Blacks. It is through codes like this that the racial label Blacks, Negros, is used to identify with slavery. Now, despite these very similar beginnings, and things like this are happening in all these jurisdictions, by the mid to late 18th century, by the time of the age of revolution, we have massive differences in racial formations in a place like Havana compared to Virginia and New Orleans. Take a look at this. In a place like Havana, although the majority of the people who are non-white are enslaved, there is a significant population of African descent that is free. In fact, a full one-third of the non-white population is constituted by people who are not enslaved, who are free. In other words, the association between enslavement and Blackness that local legislators had tried to inscribe in the law since the very beginning of colonization in the 16th century had basically failed by the mid-18th century. By comparison, or by contrast, if you look at Virginia or New Orleans, the proportion of the free people of color in the non-white population is considerably lower. In the case of Virginia, is so minuscule as to be statistically basically insignificant. This divergence has crystallized by the time of the Age of Revolution. And the question is why? How come how come from these beginnings, from these shared beginnings, from these shared legal efforts to inscribe Blackness as a category of debasement that is associated with slavery, how do we go from this to these outcomes, to these differences by the mid 18th century? The short answer here is that unlike Virginia and Louisiana, in Cuba, manumission, which is the right of a slave owner to grant freedom to an enslaved person, manumission is a slave owner's right, okay? That right was never curtailed in Cuba. And that created opportunities for the enslaved to claim their freedom, to push for their freedom, created spaces, legal, social, political spaces that the enslaved could use to fight for their freedom, following different strategies. And we discuss some of those strategies in the book, and we can talk further about this in the Q&A session if you want. By contrast, in both Virginia and Louisiana, manumissions were curtailed legally. Manumissions in both places required additional official approval, frequently by the regional assemblies, in order to be effective. In other words, slave owners in Virginia and Louisiana could not simply individually, as private owners, grant freedom to their own slaves. Why this divergence? Well, somebody like Tannenbaum would say, well, this is a question of legal traditions. And in some ways, he was right. The divergence did begin with legal traditions because, as Tannenbaum emphasized decades ago, the right to manumission was firmly entrenched in the Iberian legal world of slavery by the time of the Iberians reached the Americas. This was a well-known, widely practiced institution in the Iberian world, in the Iberian Peninsula itself. But the fundamental thing for us is that in the Iberian world, manumission was not linked to the construction of a racial order. In other words, in the Iberian world, manumission was linked to the practice of ransoming Christian and Muslim slaves in the Mediterranean world, Muslim captives, Christian captives, and was conceived as a way to move people from one status to the other. It had nothing to do with processes of racial formations or with racial anxieties. That process, in fact, included many people, many enslaved people in the Mediterranean world of the early 16th century, who were described as white slaves, people from the Eastern Mediterranean. So as an institution, manumission had nothing to do with the sort of race making that local legislators were trying to promote in those regulations that I made reference to before. The institution of manumission was already part of that legal world by the time the Iberians arrived in the New World. As they tried to create these racial orders, manumission, in fact, the institution of manumission, the right of slave owners to give freedom to their slaves, in fact, worked to dismantle, to limit, to complicate the efforts to create a racial order. In Virginia and in Louisiana, on the other hand, local legislators, the same legislators who were trying to build this racial order, who were inscribing Blackness as a debased category in the law, had the opportunity to regulate manumission, to make sure that large groups of free people of color would not emerge, to make sure that in practice and in society, people of African descent, the overwhelming majority of people of African descent, would in fact be enslaved, and therefore were able to regulate the manumissions in a way that were congruent with their efforts to build a racial order. In any case, these legal traditions are an important reference point, but the story, of course, did not end here. Because in a sense, the Age of Revolution was a transformative moment for the three jurisdictions for different reasons, but a transformative moment for each jurisdiction, including Virginia. The free population of color actually increased significantly in Virginia, as you can see, between the mid-18th century and the 1830s or so. In other words, there is an expansion of opportunities for manumission also in Virginia during these years. The free population of color exploded in New Orleans during this period, in part because Louisiana was under Spanish control after 1763. And by being under Spanish control, the Spanish legislation concerning manumissions got transferred to Louisiana. And many locally enslaved people took advantage of these regulations to push for their own freedom, to find ways to escape from slavery. The free population of color of New Orleans also increased significantly because many of the refugees from Saint-Domingue, many of whom were free people of color, who had settled in Eastern Cuba after the revolution in Haiti, many of those people migrated to New Orleans because they got expelled from Cuba once Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula, invaded Spain. So the number of free people of color jumps drastically, as you can see, in New Orleans, in part because of the influx of these people. By then, the free population of color in Havana was already fairly large. But it looked for a moment during the Age of Revolutions, it looked like as if these societies which had been diverging in the previous centuries were in fact going to come to a point of, to some sort of meeting point. There is, however, a significant difference between this, behind these trends. And that significant difference, I think, or we think, have to do with the political readings and the political impact of the Haitian Revolution, a process that, of course, terrified slave owners everywhere, in all these jurisdictions and beyond. A successful slave revolution that destroyed the most successful and profitable plantations slave economy in the Americas. But the political connotations of Black freedom, how Black freedom was understood under the umbrella, under the influence of the Haitian Revolution, was vastly different in each of these jurisdictions. In Cuba and in Spanish Louisiana, manumission and the very existence of communities of free people of color were linked not to any revolution, but were linked, in fact, to traditional and time-honored practices enslaving. To the notion that slaves, enslaved people, were royal subjects, were vassals of the king, and that they could move from one status to the other, thanks to the quote-unquote generosity and magnanimity of their owners. Manumission in Spanish Louisiana and in Spanish Cuba was an institution of the Ancien Regime. It was not an institution of the revolutionary Atlantic. In Virginia, conversely, the expansion of the free population of color was understood with the idiom of black citizenship, was understood as steps towards general emancipation, which was not the case in Cuba or Spanish Louisiana. In Spanish Louisiana and Spanish Cuba, manumission is a private thing. It's a private action by a pious and religious, generous owner who gives, quote unquote, freedom. And I put quotes because frequently what happened in real life was that the enslaved people took the initiative in order to escape from slavery. But in Virginia, this growth is interpreted as a steps towards general emancipation and towards, in a Republican order, unavoidably towards Black citizenship. So we did work actually in Richmond in the archives to locate and study numerous popular petitions that describe free Blacks as an evil that would destroy the new state, and that requested the abrogation of the manumission law of 1782, which made it possible for Virginian slave owners to grant freedom to their slaves. These petitions characterized manumission as partial emancipations, quote unquote, a clear reference to the sort of political fears that were associated the possibility of manumission with Black citizenship, steps towards the abolition of slavery. In Virginia, therefore, manumission was linked from the beginning, since the approval of that law of 1782, to debates about equality, political participation, Black citizenship. If Black people ceased to be enslaved, they would have to be equal citizens. Such fears were not experienced similarly in Cuba, and at least for a while in Spanish Louisiana. So it is not particularly surprising then that as early as 1806, both Virginia and Louisiana now under American control, began to reintroduce legal barriers to manumissions, began to close down on this interlude of possible Black freedom that takes place during the age of revolution. There is an inflection point here. In Virginia, the legislature provided that any enslaved person who obtained freedom would have to leave the estate after 6 months. In Louisiana, the law of 1807 provided that any new manumission, as during the French period, would require official approval. Individual slave owners were no longer entitled to give freedom to their own slaves. None of these regulations, by the way, prevented the actions and the initiatives of enslaved people and their families in all of these places. That is a regularity. And we find numerous examples of this, and we try to build our chapters around these examples, in fact. But these efforts in Virginia and Louisiana clearly indicated that freedom and citizenship were conditions reserved only for whites, that they were not compatible with Blackness. We identified then a turning point in the legal regimes concerning free people of color, and a new moment, a new start, a restart in these diverging trajectories, right, concerning race in these societies in the 1830s, where when several events made the free population of color appear increasingly as an intolerable threat to whites, particularly in Virginia and Louisiana. In 1829, David Walker, a free colored man, published his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, an incendiary call to world citizens to do justice to people of African descent, and warning white slave owners that their end was near and that it would be tragic, as tragic perhaps as the Haitian Revolution. And just a couple of years later, that ominous future appeared to be possible with the Nat Turner rebellion, which you probably know about this rebellion more than I do, and resulted in the deaths of 55 white people in Virginia. This rebellion seemed to fulfill Walker's ominous prophecies. Alarms of slave rebellions sounded all over the South. And we actually found echoes of this in the newspapers of New Orleans, which were typically very reluctant to publish anything, absolutely anything dealing with slavery anywhere. The newspapers of New Orleans called for exemplary punishment for any acts of slave resistance, particularly those happening in Virginia. In Cuba, colonial authorities recorded more than 20 slave rebellions between 1812 and 1844, when a vast conspiracy involving rural and urban slaves, as well as free people of color from Matanzas and Havana was discovered. So the confluence of abolitionism, slave rebellions, and the growing population of free people of color, even in places like Virginia, led slave owners to fear alliances between enslaved people and free blacks. They had constructed blackness as a category that transcended status. Now they feared that that very category would come back to haunt them by facilitating alliances between enslaved people and free people of color. It was in that context that popular proposals for so-called colonization plans, through which free blacks would be removed and sent to some remote territory, preferably in Africa, took hold. Virginia planters represented the core of the American colonization society. And the main goal of the society, as you probably know, was to eliminate the existence of free blacks in the States, was to send them somewhere else. As a popular petition signed by 96 citizens, all of them white, needless to say, of Northampton County in Virginia, stated in 1825, free blacks, I quote, are inferior in intelligence and formation to whites, degraded by the stain of their color, excluded from all civil rights held by the most humble white man, and excluded from any participation in government, end of the quote. There was, in other words, no space for them in Republican society. If a person of African descent became white, that person had to be removed and sent somewhere else. The year 1831, in our estimation, marked the beginning of a true legal onslaught against free people of color in both Virginia and Louisiana. In addition to efforts to remove them and to send them to Africa, new provisions established restrictions on movement, on their right to remain in their place of origin, on property rights. In Virginia, a new provision of 1832 reiterated the prohibition of 1806 that free people of color had to move out of their state or face re-enslavement. Although many free people of color actually managed to remain in their state illegally, the law, of course, introduced powerful uncertainty into the lives of free people of color, whose very existence, whose very presence in the state could prompt legal action. The archives of Virginia are filled with requests to remain legally in the state. Between 1830 and 1860, there were, or at least we were able to identify 124 documented cases of proceedings against illegal Black residents in Virginia. You know, this number may not appear to be too high, 124, but think about the implications of this, that legal actors, that legal authorities can come after you just for the only crime is being there, is remaining in the state of your birth. In New Orleans, a law of 1830 required a substantial bond of $1,000 for any manumission to ensure that freed persons would not remain in the state without a special license. From 1852 onwards, manumissions only proceeded if a ticket to Liberia was paid. In other words, any person who obtained freedom would have to abandon the state, would have to leave Louisiana. The number of free people of color who tried to regularize their residence during the 1850s in New Orleans grew exponentially. We found no records of such petitions in the early 1850s, in 1852 or 1853, but to give you a quick example, by later in the decade, by 1859, we found 420 such petitions. These are people who were initiating legal procedures to remain legally in the city of their birth. The number of unlawful residence arrests against free people of color in New Orleans grew from about 10 per month in 1850 to about 100 per month in 1859. This is an assault on the most basic right of all, the right to a homeland, the right to live in a place. In a supreme legislative effort to perfect this association between Blackness and slavery, both Virginia and Louisiana passed voluntary re-enslavement laws in the 1850s. And in both cases, there are examples of people who took advantage of such legislation so that they could stay close to their loved ones. At the same time, steps were taken to eliminate manumissions once and for all. The Constitution of the State of Virginia in 1851 proclaimed that the General Assembly would not approve any additional manumission going forward. In Louisiana, a law of 1857 declared manumissions of any kind illegal. The free colored community of New Orleans, if we go back here, this free colored community, which managed to be as large as that of Havana, had collapsed socially and demographically and politically by the late 1850s and 1860s. Now, the free population of color suffered something of a legal assault also in Cuba, particularly after that conspiracy that I made reference to in the 1840s. And the clearest example of this is that in 1844, for the first time since in all the colonial period, Spanish colonial authorities banned the so-called Negro militia, the Pardos y Morenos, which was a traditional military institution that free people of color had used as a platform for social mobility and for social respectability. Cuban slave owners, in fact, looked at the US South. They looked at places like Virginia and Louisiana with envy, lamenting the existence of a large free population of color in the island. As the town council of Havana noted in 1826, I quote, "In the United States, it is absolutely prohibited for any master to give freedom to his slaves, because they believe that freedmen awaken fatal ideas and desires among those who are not," end of the quote. The Captain General of Cuba, in a private correspondence to the king in 1832, noted the following, I quote, "Having made the mistake of not placing obstacles to freedom, to make it difficult and slow, and making matters worse by the indifference with which the propagation of free blacks has been met, it is now imprudent to correct all omissions and defects," end of the quote. It is now imprudent. In other words, this population was just too large to get rid of it. Blackness in Cuba, as a result, would not be coterminous with enslavement. Blackness in Cuba could coexist with notions of respectability, with participation in the public life, with spaces for Black public activities, and eventually citizenship. By 1860, an enslaved person in Cuba would encounter free people of African descent on a regular basis. It was almost impossible for an enslaved person in Cuba, in mid-19th century Cuba, not to encounter free people of color. Such a possibility was rare, even impossible in most areas of Virginia and Louisiana at the same time. This in turn helped to consolidate the link between Blackness and enslavement that legislators had tried to inscribe in the law since the early colonial period. The very existence of free communities of color was an obstacle to the creation of a racial order of enslaved Blacks and free white citizens on the other hand. Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney, in the infamous Dred Scott decision, said this right. In the United States, he said, I quote, perpetual and impenetrable, end of the quote, barrier that barrier was not between enslaved and free. That barrier was between blacks and whites. Such a barrier existed in Cuba as well, but it was not as impenetrable as it was in the United States. So let me finish with just a note about this. Laws regulating free people of color were good platforms, were useful platforms, were useful reference for post-emancipation societies. They could be used to maintain Black. Now that slavery had ended, they could be used. They could be deployed to maintain people of African descent in a subordinate social position. The laws regulating slavery were, in fact, of limited use after emancipation, although personally, I think this is an area in which we need to do additional research. In the transit from Black slave to Black citizen, the common thread, therefore, was not, as Tannenbaum would say, from slave to citizen. In fact, the common thread is from Black to Black. And if you're going to try to understand the situation of Blacks in late 19th century, in these societies in the late 19th century, one should go back not to slavery. One should go back to these understandings of race difference and status in these societies. The meanings of Blackness under slavery did not stop with emancipation. Those meanings, those associations continued. They spilled over, and they shaped later struggles over race and citizenship. And so our book ends with something of an invitation to look forward, to continue this story after emancipation and to see where it goes. And perhaps one of the students listening to this presentation will someday take on such a project under the direction of my colleague Bernard. And with that, I will give the floor back to Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor De La Fuente. I am now going to hand over the reins to our treasurer here, Thomas Miller, who's going to direct our Q&A. Thomas?
Okay, so if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat and I'll deliver them verbally, or you could raise your hand and be selected that way. Thank you.
I just would like to say thank you very, very much to Dr. De La Fuente, if I may. Muchísimas gracias de mi corazón, profesor. Yo soy de Puerto Rico y entonces de niña tenía muchas amistades de Cuba y esta presentación ha llenado mi corazón y muchísimas gracias y espero que vuelva.
Thank you so much. Is it Anita?
Anita, sí.
Anita, thank you so much. Muchas gracias for your kind words. And you know, Puerto Rico and Cuba are basically, Bernard and I were talking about this before today. You know, the islands of the Caribbean are pretty much part of the same ecosystem, and Puerto Rico and Cuba are basically two sister islands. So it's good to have una puertorriqueña con nosotros hoy. Gracias, Anita.
Fuente, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for your wonderful presentation. My question is fairly simple. For those of us who don't specialize in this field or don't specialize in this time period, what would be, you think, the most important takeaways from your research comparing these locations?
You know, it's a great question, Bernard. Thanks for that. Look, I think the main takeaway in some ways from the book and from our research is that I mentioned this commonality in all these jurisdictions in terms of race making through the law, right? There is another massive commonality, and that is how Africans and people of African descent, enslaved people and free people of color, but particularly enslaved people, across jurisdictions, and that includes Louisiana and Virginia as well, made use of every little crack that they could find in the law, in administrative procedures, to subvert, in fact, the process of racialization that legislators had tried to produce since very early on. So in each of the chapters, we basically start with an anecdote of an enslaved person in Virginia, in Louisiana, in Cuba, trying to navigate this legal maze under which they lived, and trying to find spaces that they could use to claim freedom. I'll give you an example. There is a law passed in the 1780s in Virginia that prohibits the importation of new slaves into the state. That law has nothing to do with Black freedom. This is a law that has to do with taxation and stuff like that. Well, that law is used by many enslaved people to claim freedom, because they claim they were brought to the state illegally after the law, that they were brought after the law was passed. So a law that had nothing to do with Black freedom is used by people of African descent to, in fact, articulate arguments for their own freedom. And there are dozens of these cases in the archives of Virginia. That kind of creativity, that kind of agency, historians would say that kind of agency is everywhere. So if you want to take away from the book, I think that's the one takeaway. First, that the processes of racialization in the law, of race making in the law, cut across the imperial boundaries. It's not that that the English are worse than the Spanish, or the Spanish are better than the Portuguese. This is across the board. This is a truly Atlantic process. At the same time, the other massive commonality is how people of African descent try to use those very regulations whenever possible to their advantage to claim freedom. In early 19th century Virginia, for instance, some people, since opportunities for manumission were so restricted, the one way out of enslavement was to claim that one was not Black. And one way to do that was to find some indigenous ancestry. And if you could demonstrate that, a great grandmother was an indigenous woman, then you could demonstrate that you were not in fact Black legally and that you should be free. And when one of those cases prospered, then everybody around that family, in those networks would in fact try to use that to claim freedom for themselves. So in each of these cases, in Louisiana, we've seen cases as late as the 1850s in which enslaved people tried to use the Spanish law of the late 18th century to claim freedom. They say that they should not be enslaved because under Spanish law, and then, by then the courts of Louisiana say, yeah, nice try, try again. So those are the two big takeaways from the book.
Thank you, Professor.
We have a question from Grace Cheeseman in the chat. It says, she asks, in your opinion, why do you think the entrenchment of racial animosity still exists in many parts of the United States?
Well, it's a massive question, right? If you look at these regulations as we have, what you realize what we are up against. These are centuries in which all this knowledge is produced, right? All these associations between Blackness is constructed in a way First, it is constructed in opposition to whiteness. Okay, that opposition is ingrained in the law, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. That polarization, right, is built into a law. We are dealing with that. We are dealing with everything that was anchored in these legal systems for centuries. But if I may, I would add another ingredient there, which we touch upon briefly in the book, although we don't really devote much, that much attention to it. But I think it's relevant for the question that was posed. And in the 19th century, there is an added element to this, and that added element is science. Science comes to reinforce older understandings of difference. Now, with the alleged objectivity that science uniquely claims. Science claims to be a non-political form of knowledge. Science claims to be objective. Science claims to be to advance understandings that are based on empirical evidence. And during the 19th century, science contributes enormously to solidify these understandings of human difference, to solidify the notion of Black inescapable inferiority, which is transformed into a biological inferiority, something that you cannot escape. You cannot run from biology. You cannot run from your DNA, right? This is it. So in the 19th century, you get this added layer. Now, this is not bad science. This is the leading science of the 19th century. These are some of the leading scholars and the leading minds, some of the best minds, including some colleagues here, here at Harvard, who were leading proponents of all this nonsense. But that what we now see as nonsense was leading science then. They were publishing this in leading journals. So science adds yet another layer to these older understandings of difference in the 19th century. That's what we are up against. We have to unlearn so many things in order to learn to look at each other differently and through other prisms. This is not impossible. Race is a socially constructed category. Race is a constructed lie. Race is not a given. People are not born. When you are born, you don't know how to classify people according to race. You learn these things. It can be dismantled. But in order to dismantle that, we have to undo all the work that was done over centuries to solidify these categories in legal discourse, in political discourse, in scientific discourse. That's part of our culture.
Okay, great.
I got a question here. Do you have any more questions you want to do first, or
There's one more in the chat. If
go ahead. Okay, do that.
Okay. Lori Ann Thompson asks, first says, thank you for this great research, Professor. And then asks, looking at the meaning of Blackness in law, can you speak to the use of legal tactics through the years to prevent people of color from gaining home ownership and generational wealth?
Well, one of the things that I quickly mentioned is that we find after the 1830s that in places like Virginia and Louisiana, you have these laws that begin to limit property rights among free people of African descent, including notably, but consequentially, I mean, the right to own enslaved people, which had become one of the few ways in which enslaved people could escape from slavery was by being purchased by a free member of their extended families. Even that possibility is curtailed in places like Virginia and Louisiana. So this is a true legal assault. But it's a legal assault. Realize that this is a legal assault mostly on free Blacks. it's not so much on enslaved people, it's on free blacks, is making possible that black citizenship becomes politically impossible, unviable. If you are a free person of African descent, you simply do not belong. Forget about accumulating wealth. You cannot even be in your place of birth. You cannot remain in your place of birth. And if you remain, you are always subject to being detained and to being deported or being sent God knows where through one of these colonization plans, you know. And there are examples, quite a few examples of free people of color demanding the right to remain in their places of birth, you know, close to their families. And these examples of re-enslavement, I showed one of the documents, are absolutely dramatic. These are people who choose to go back into slavery so that they can remain close to family, so that they can remain close to their kin. You know, these are usually elder people who simply, you know, how are they going to survive if they are expelled from their state? These are dramatic cases, and we looked into some of those in the book.
Okay, excellent. What you have the floor?
Yes, thank you very much. Professor, thanks for a great lecture. I am interested in many things, but if we look at the link between manumission and the racial order, I think there's a lot to sort of unpack there, looking at different societies. And one question I have is, because manumission was sort of, you know, that the racial order was different from place to place, if I understood you, should we therefore now see a difference between the way in which Blacks are looked at in the United States as opposed to Cuba? That's one. And the second one is, in some slave societies, of course, and even post-slave societies, there are racial categories in which, for example, there are people sometimes in the French Caribbean, it would be like les gens de couleur, in which a lot of people are mixed race. In the United States, it's a different thing where you're either black or white down the line. So how do you see that linkage sort of operating in those cases? So again, two questions. One, the first one about whether the condition or the way in which Blacks are perceived in Cuba is it different to the way in which Blacks are perceived in the United States, based on the way in which manumission was carried out and all that? And that's the first question. And the second one, as I said, where do people of color, where do they fit into your construct of Black, you know, a common thread from Black to Black, which I agree with, by the way.
So the first, so these are two good questions. The first one is, I think we have our answer, at least to this question, Bernard, is that the very existence of a free population of people of African descent, which is the outcome of these manumission practices, right? That population comes to be because there are ways for slave owners to grant freedom. Okay, that's what the law does. Enslaved people use those laws to then demand freedom, but what the law has is a right of the slave owner to give freedom. By resulting in the creation of relatively large communities of free people of color, Blackness is no longer socially identified with slavery the way it is identified in many areas of Louisiana and Virginia. In many areas of Louisiana and Virginia by 1850, to be Black is to be enslaved. It's the statistical chance that you are going to encounter a free Black in some areas of Louisiana and Virginia are close to zero. In Cuba, it's almost impossible not to find a person who is Black and free. So the association between Blackness and slavery that legislators try to do across the board has basically not worked in a place like Cuba. Blackness and freedom are compatible, socially compatible in Cuba, because something like 20% of the total population is made up of people who are both of African descent and free. It's just part of the society. As the Cuban town council, as the Cuban governor said, unfortunately, it's too late now. We have these people here, we cannot get rid of them. We have to somehow deal with them. He regrets the presence of those people, but Cuban slave owners cannot come up with a colonization society type of solution. They cannot simply try to export these people out of the island. They have to live with them. It's just too large and too powerful a community to be eliminated. And that creates, of course, very different, that's the difference in perceptions of what it means to be Black in one society and the other. In places like Virginia and Louisiana, the very possibility of Black freedom is under assault.
Mhm.
Blackness is slavery. Blackness is enslavement. In Cuba, that possibility, the very possibility of Black freedom persists and expands, in fact, not because slave owners would not want, that's why I included the quote about the US South. They're looking at Virginia and they're looking at Louisiana and they're saying, this is what we should be doing, but they just don't have the political tools to do that. So that speaks to this question of how people of African descent are perceived socially and the sort of opportunities they have. The fact that you can, that a Black man can go and marry legally a white woman in Cuba is not a minor thing. That was illegal in Virginia until 1967. I mean, this is yesterday. Okay, there you have a massive difference in racial formation and in understandings of racial difference. So on the other question, the question of the intermediate groups, which are so important in the Caribbean, such groups existed, of course, in Louisiana and Virginia as well, but they tend to be labeled, they tend to be categorized as Black, they tend to be pushed into the Black category. So these intermediate categories, which by the way, in US censuses do show up in the early 19th century, those categories legally, those people tend to be treated as if they were Black. You may have you probably noticed the last image I showed of this sort of respectably looking ladies of light complexion, right? Of African descent, but light complexion. That's kind of those intermediate groups that you are referring to, and that complicates understanding of race even further in a place like Cuba versus Virginia and Louisiana. But we do not, that's not our analytical anchor in this book, in part because legally speaking, those people in the US tend to be treated as just as Blacks.
I wanted to also say thank you, Dr. de la Fuente. I'm so sorry that I missed the first 22 minutes. I'm hoping that you will come back. And I'm also wondering if this recorded lecture will be made available to those of us who were unable to attend from the beginning. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
So, Professor, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and take that one. There's a question of whether or not the professor will consent to this being on YouTube. However, I do have a recording of it, and if the professor is all right with that, it would be on YouTube, just under his name, in the Alexandrians at VCU, I believe is the channel.
And of course you have my consent. Let me say this, we produce scholarship to the colleagues who are here. We produce scholarship to share our findings. There is absolutely no point in doing this kind of work and then hiding it from. Once you write a book, the book ceases to be yours. It's not your book anymore. The book belongs to, you share it with colleagues, you share it with students, and then at that point, it's part of the conversation. Hopefully, that's the success. That's a good part. People read it and they will find things that are convincing, other that perhaps are not, which is totally fine. And then that's what leads to new books. That's what leads to new research projects. That's how knowledge production grows. So it's, I would never do one of these talks to then, without, under condition that it could not be public, because, the whole purpose of things like this is to have an opportunity to share these results, to share the research, and to also to hear back, questions, comments, suggestions from people. So of course you have my consent. Yeah.
Thank you. And I actually have a question. You mentioned that books beget more scholarship, and I was wondering if you had an idea of where you might like your someone else to pick up, and or is there anything that you haven't covered that you'd like someone to look into, perhaps?
Well, in some ways, we end the book in a frustrating moment, because the book ends up kind of suggesting that this divergent paths that we have tried to explain probably, that probably helps to explain longer term developments in terms of racial formation in societies like Virginia and Cuba through the 20th century. I mentioned the interracial marriage statutes in Virginia, being in the books until very, very late in the 20th century, something absolutely unthinkable in Cuba, which of course doesn't mean that Cuba was not a racist society, or that people of African descent did not face enormous challenges in Cuba as well. But in some ways, the book ends with this promise that this history is very important for a future that we do not tell. And we finish the book, you almost, I feel as an author, like, we needed a second book. I've talked to Ariel about that. I don't know if this is a book that we are going to do, because the other part of this is that co-authored books have their own challenges, of course. Some of the colleagues here, some of my colleagues, historians, will probably know what I'm talking about. You have to, for a book like this, we needed co-authorship, because we needed to master, archival sources from very different places. We use sources in 3 different languages. Scholarly bodies of scholarship, which are vastly different when it comes to Louisiana, Virginia, Cuba. So we needed to join forces to produce a book like this. But having done that, having produced this book, we end the book with an invitation for another book, in a sense. Whether we'll do it or not, I do not know, Charlie, the answer to that. But I do hope, I will say this, I do hope that somebody will someday, even if it is to say they didn't get it right, we need to change the story, which is totally fine. But I think there is much to learn. There is much to learn about how race works by looking at these things comparatively. Sometimes we think that race is, I'll give you an example. This sort of police brutality that we have witnessed quite graphical in the last few years, this racialized police brutality that we have seen. Well, I always say that the one country in the Americas where the largest number of people of African descent die at the hands of the police every year is not the United States. It is actually Brazil. That kind of racialized police violence, we tend to think sometimes about it as a uniquely American phenomenon. It is not. And therefore, when you look at these things comparatively, when you look at other scenarios, other questions, other understandings emerge. At the end of the day, that's the invitation of our work.
Okay, I'd like to just jump in here finally, and again, the more I hear, the more I am drawn to continuing this debate. And I am teaching a new course at VCU, the History Department, next semester, and I'm calling it Slavery, Race, and Global Development. And what I want to do is to start with the construction of otherness, because it seems to me, even listening to you, that construction is vital if we are to understand how race plays out over the centuries. And I recently reviewed a work on the French Antilles, and it talks about the role of missionaries, French missionaries in the construction of otherness. And it's just, I am familiar with the work of some of these missionaries, Jesuits and others, and it's just incredible, how they advanced this whole business of otherness in the metropolitan areas through their writings and so forth. And having listened to you, I'm thinking, one of the things we have done with the Alexandrian Society in the past is to have symposiums where we would have about 8 scholars come together under the umbrella of choose a topic and have them do this. And it just seems to me that if we are able to do some more of that, it would be interesting to look at this racial order, because I think people in this society, and maybe elsewhere as well, I suppose, don't understand the construction and how it has played out over time, over the centuries. And I think that's what we're dealing with right here in the United States at this time, when we look at, let's say, even these 2 trials that most people are on the edge waiting for verdicts. And I think it would be useful for us to, this would have to be in person, of course, not through Zoom, but you piqued my interest in that this afternoon, and I look forward to developing closer relations with you, and so that I think we can come together and continue some of this work.
It will be my pleasure, Bernard. And these are very important questions, and one of the things in which we have advanced a great deal is in I'm very invested in the field of Afro-Latin American studies and sort of promoting the field of Afro-Latin American studies, which basically means in centering the experiences and contributions of people of African descent in the history of Latin America. It's putting an Afro-emphasis in the history of Latin America, which otherwise can be perceived as a history basically devoid of racism or devoid of people of African descent.
That's right.
And by doing that, what we do is to invite, in fact, is in some ways to provincialize the U.S. Is to say, the questions of race are not uniquely American, although they may take, they take their different forms in different localities and in different places. That applies to Latin America as well. But for I always tell my colleagues who work on this in the U.S. that it's very useful to look at these other cases, because it helps put things in a different perspective. Sometimes to highlight differences, like we do in the book, but sometimes to highlight similarities, like we do in the book too. It's not. This is. I think it was Charlie at the beginning who mentioned that the society is very interested in Atlantic history and in these Atlantic frameworks. That's what the Atlantic framework helps to achieve, in fact, is to go across these national boundaries and to look at processes of racialization and racial formation across what now are national borders. Which did not exist 200 years ago. and think about the fact, the basic fact, that the frequently forgotten fact, that of the 11 million Africans who arrived in the New World between the early 16th century and the late 19th century, less than 5% came to what is today the United States. Over 95% went to Latin America and the Caribbean. So if you are serious about the African experience in the Americas, you must look beyond just the United States. You must look at the Caribbean, you must look at places like Brazil.
I think it would be very interesting for me. I'm sorry, I teach Latin American literature and language, and I'm from Mexico originally. So for me, it would be interesting to also see a study that would make a contrast between countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, where people of African descent are the majority, versus places where they mix with the other groups, such as Mexico, both in terms of legal issues and also socioeconomic opportunities. So
we are getting there, Maribel. It's going to take us a while, but the scholarship on Afro-Latin America is growing fast. And what I mean fast is that this is a booming field. It's a multidisciplinary field like African American studies. And in some ways, it's a field that has emerged in the last 2 decades, has sort of come together in the last 2 decades because of Afro-descendant activism all over Latin America, just like African American studies emerged in the US in the wake of struggles for civil rights and stuff like that. And the scholarship has advanced unevenly in the various countries, so it's probably still difficult to do the sort of systematic comparison that you are calling for, but there are at least some examples. I would point you to George Reed Andrews's book Afro-Latin America, which tries to do some of that, even though you will not find in it the sort of systematic comparison between countries like Mexico or Peru, where the population of African descent, which was once very large, sort of is less visible now, but with countries like Brazil or Colombia, where those populations are very visible. But this is happening. This scholarship is happening as we speak.
Okay, Charlie, you can wrap up now.
All right, if nobody has any more questions, I'd like to thank Professor De La Fuente for coming and speaking to us today. I'd also like to thank, excuse me, both the Departments of History and the Department of African American Studies here at VCU for sponsoring this today and helping us lure Dr. De La Fuente to us. I'd also like to thank Bernard Moit, and if he has any final thoughts, I'd like to offer him the floor.
The final thought is for you all to lobby VCU to, as students and who are trying to advance intellectual inquiry, to put some money behind you so we can get more of this done. As you know, I've waged struggle after struggle, and it's pretty tiring, and it's it's the frustration that I've undergone for some time is just unbearable sometimes. So as I'm saying, that you all ought to be able to impress upon VCU the need for us to engage in activities such as this, and for them to put some resources behind it so we can do more of it. So thanks to everyone for coming out. This was, I'm very, very pleased at the proceedings today, and look forward to, as I said, more of this in the next semester.
Thank you for the invitation. I would have loved to come in person. I have to say, it's better to actually be with people, to see people in 3D. But
oh yes,
but we live in these times, right? So we do the best we can.
Yeah,
Thank
but as I said, that's how we used to do it. And we used to then entertain the professors and come together with them and students and some folks from the history department and other folks getting together, but we're hoping to get back there. So stay tuned.
Thank you.